The courtroom smelled of old wood, floor wax, and the cold metallic scent of broken promises. It was a space designed for order, but to Silas Thorne, it felt like a vacuum, sucking the very air from his lungs. He sat perfectly still, his spine pressed against the hard back of the chair, his hands folded on the polished mahogany table. Across from him sat Clara. She looked smaller than he remembered, or perhaps it was just the way she carried herself now, hunched slightly, as if bracing for a blow that had already landed. She didn't look at him. Not once. Her gaze was fixed on the document resting between them, the final decree of a marriage that had lasted 5 years and was ending in less than 30 minutes. The scratching of the pen was the only sound in the room. To Silas, it was deafening, louder than the ticking clock on the wall or the muffled conversations of other couples in the hallway waiting to legally dissolve their lives. He watched Clara's hand. Her fingers gripped the silver pen too tight, the knuckles turning white. Her wrist trembled, a rhythmic, frantic shaking that she tried to steady with her other hand. It was a gesture he knew by heart, the way she always behaved when she was fighting back tears, trying to maintain a dignity she felt slipping away. When she finally finished, she slid the papers across the table toward him. The sound of the parchment against the wood was like the last breath leaving a body, hissing, final, and hollow. Silas picked up the pen. For months, he had convinced himself this was the only way forward. His business partner, Julian Vex, had spent a year whispering in his ear, a constant drip of poison disguised as ambition. "You're a builder, Silas," Julian had said over expensive scotch. "You build empires. You can't move toward the sun while you're dragging the weight of a failing marriage behind you. Solitude is the price of power." Silas had believed him. He had looked at the long hours at the office, the missed dinners, and the growing silence in their mansion, and he had diagnosed it as a failure of the marriage rather than a failure of his own presence. He wanted his focus back. He wanted to be the man he was before Clara, untethered and hungry. He signed his name quickly. He did it decisively, the way he closed a real estate deal, hoping the speed would numb the sting. The ink bled into the paper, blue and permanent. Just like that, the years of shared laughter, the late-night conversations about the future, and the dreams of a family they had once whispered about in the dark were reduced to 2 signatures that would be filed away in a basement and forgotten by everyone but them. Clara stood immediately. She didn't wait for the judge to speak or for the lawyers to offer their rehearsed sympathies. She grabbed her purse, her movements jerky and uncoordinated. "Wait," Silas heard himself say. The word escaped him before he could stop it, a reflexive plea from a part of him that wasn't ready for the silence. She stopped, her hand on the heavy brass door handle, her back to him. He could see her shoulders rise and fall with a deep, shuddering breath. She stood there for a long moment, gathering the strength to speak. When she finally turned, her face was a mask of exhaustion. There was no anger in her eyes, which was somehow worse. There was only a profound, echoing sadness. "I hope you find what you're looking for, Silas," she said quietly. She didn't wait for an answer. She opened the door and walked out, her footsteps fading down the marble hallway until they were swallowed by the ambient noise of the courthouse. Silas sat there, staring at the empty doorway. The door swung slowly closed with a soft pneumatic hiss. Final. Absolute. "Mr. Thorne?" Silas blinked, looking up at his lawyer, a man named Atkins who had a face like crumpled parchment. "The paperwork will be finalized within the week," Atkins said, gathering his briefcase. "You'll receive the digital copies by Friday. You're a free man, Silas. Congratulations, I suppose." "I know," Silas said, his voice sounding like it belonged to a stranger. He didn't want the congratulations. He didn't want to think about Friday. He gathered his own copies of the decree, the paper feeling unnaturally heavy in his hands, and walked out. The courthouse was a hive of activity. Lawyers in 3-piece suits hurried past him. Families waited on benches with anxious faces. Children ran through the corridors, oblivious to the gravity of the rooms around them. Silas felt completely disconnected, like a ghost haunting his own life. He took the stairs instead of the elevator, needing the physical exertion, needing the sensation of descending to match the sinking feeling in his gut. Outside, the sky had turned a bruised, heavy purple.
A steady drizzle had started to fall, slicking the city's streets and turning the afternoon into a gray, washed-out blur. Silas walked to his car, a black luxury sedan that cost more than the apartment Clara had moved into. He sat behind the wheel, the engine silent, holding the signed papers in his lap. He had done it. He had ripped the anchor away. He was free to build, to climb, to become the titan Julian Vex promised he could be. So why did he feel like he had just committed a slow-motion suicide? His phone buzzed in the center console. It was a text from Julian. "It's done. The Sterling deal is back on the table now that the legal distractions are cleared. We're celebrating at the penthouse tonight. Bring that focus with you, Silas. Leave the past in the rain." Silas looked at the screen, then at the divorce papers. He looked at the signature, Silas Thorne, slashed across the bottom of the page in bold, arrogant strokes. It was the proof that he had given up on the only person who had ever seen the man beneath the money. "Sure," he whispered to the empty car. "Time to move forward." He started the engine. The car purred to life, a masterpiece of engineering that insulated him from the sound of the rain and the world outside. He pulled out of the parking lot, the tires splashing through deep puddles. He didn't know where he was going, not really. He just needed to drive. He needed to move away from the courthouse, away from the ink, and away from the image of Clara's trembling hand. As he merged into the heavy city traffic, the rain began to fall harder, drumming against the roof of the car like 1,000 accusing fingers. He kept his eyes on the road, watching the red taillights of the cars ahead of him stretch out into an endless line of obstacles. Somewhere in this city, his ex-wife was starting a life without him. She was walking through the rain alone because he had told her she was a burden, because he had been so sure he knew what he wanted. Silas Thorne, the man who could predict market trends and build skyscrapers, had calculated everything perfectly. But as he drove through the darkening city, carrying the weight of his freedom like a lead shroud, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was the only person in the world who didn't realize he had just lost everything. He turned toward the lights of the financial district, toward the penthouse and the champagne and the focus he had fought so hard to reclaim. Behind him, the courthouse disappeared into the fog, and with it, the only life he had ever truly lived. He was moving forward, just as he had planned, but in the silence of the car, the scratching of the pen echoed on, carving a hole in his heart that no amount of gold could ever fill.
Loneliness does not announce itself with a fanfare or a shout. It moves in quietly, one empty hour at a time, until the silence of a room becomes a physical weight against the eardrums. Clara Vance sat on the floor of her new apartment, her back against a wall that hummed with the vibration of a city that didn't know she existed. The space was smaller than the walk-in closet she'd had in the Thorne mansion. It was a single room with a kitchenette tucked into a corner like an afterthought, and a bathroom so narrow she could touch both walls at once. The windows rattled when the wind picked up, a constant metallic trembling that made the entire building feel as unsteady as her own life. She looked at the last cardboard box, still taped shut. Her entire existence, the scraps Silas hadn't claimed, fit into 6 of these boxes. There was a water stain in the corner of the ceiling that looked vaguely like a map of a country she would never visit. On the windowsill, the previous tenant had left a dying spider plant, its leaves brown and spindly. Clara didn't have the heart to throw it away. Instead, she touched a withered leaf and whispered, "We'll try, won't we?" Through the thin walls, she could hear the couple in 4B. They were laughing, a bright, easy sound that cut through the drywall like a serrated blade. That had been her and Silas once. They used to laugh over burnt toast and debated over which books deserved the limited space on the nightstand. That was before Julian Vex convinced Silas that love was a luxury tax on ambition. Before Silas sat her down in their glass-walled dining room and explained, with the clinical detachment of a CEO, that he needed to optimize his future, and she was no longer part of the equation. The days that followed the divorce were a gray, indistinct blur. Clara unpacked slowly, reluctantly. She put her 2 good dresses in the closet, stacked her 3 plates in the cabinet, and lined up her books on the windowsill next to the dying plant. Everything fit.
That was the most painful part, realizing how little space she actually occupied in the world when the shadow of Silas Thorne was no longer cast over her. Then, her body began to betray her. At first, she blamed the grief. She would wake up with a stomach that felt like it was full of sea salt and lead. Coffee, which she used to crave, suddenly smelled like hot garbage. She was tired, a bone-deep, marrow-aching exhaustion that no amount of sleep could touch. She told herself it was the legal distraction Silas's lawyer had mentioned. Her body was simply processing the trauma of being discarded. But the nausea didn't fade. It grew into a constant companion. One afternoon, 3 weeks after the move, Clara stood in the shower until the water turned cold, her forehead pressed against the grime-streaked tile. She caught sight of herself in the cracked mirror as she stepped out. Her face was thinner, her eyes rimmed with the shadows of sleepless nights, but there was a subtle softness to her body, a tender fullness in her breasts that hadn't been there before. She pressed a hand to her stomach. It was flat, hollow, yet it felt occupied. She went to work at a small law office answering phones. It was a mindless job, a script she could hide behind. "Good morning, Harmon and Associates. How may I direct your call?" She liked the beige walls and the smell of burnt coffee. It was unremarkable. It was safe. But the world outside wasn't finished with her. During her lunch break, she sat on a park bench watching a mother push a stroller. The woman was laughing, wiping a smudge from her child's face with a practiced, effortless love. Her heart felt a sudden sharp twist in her chest, a longing so intense that it made her lightheaded. Across the street, a black sedan pulled up to a curb. A man stepped out. Silas. Her breath hitched. He was with Julian Vex, both of them dressed in suits that cost more than the building she lived in. Silas looked lighter. He looked like a man who had successfully cut a heavy anchor and was finally sailing towards his son. Clara stood up so quickly her sandwich fell into the dirt. She retreated behind a tree, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She watched him move with the effortless grace of the elite. He didn't look like a man who regretted anything. He looked like a man who had forgotten her name. That night, the dizziness returned with a vengeance. The room spun, and the map on her ceiling blurred into a gray vortex. The next morning, it happened. Clara was standing at the bus stop, counting the cracks in the sidewalk to keep the nausea at bay. The world tilted. The gray pavement rushed up to meet her. She felt her knees buckle, heard a distant muffled shout, and then the lights went out. She woke to the rhythmic beep, beep, beep of a heart monitor and the sterile, sharp scent of disinfectant. Fluorescent lights burned into her retinas. "Welcome back," a voice said. A doctor stood at the foot of her bed, a tablet in his hand. He looked tired but kind. His name tag said Dr. Amara. "What happened?" Clara's voice was a dry rasp. "You fainted at the bus stop. Severe dehydration and iron deficiency," Dr. Amara said. He stepped closer, his expression shifting into something softer, something more serious. "We ran some blood tests, Clara, and we did an ultrasound to check for internal injury from the fall." Clara's heart stuttered. "And?" Dr. Amara turned a monitor toward her. The screen was a dark, static-filled sea. He pointed a finger at 2 small, rhythmic flickers of light. They were tiny, no bigger than grains of rice, but they were pulsing with a fierce, undeniable energy. "There," Dr. Amara said softly, "and there. 2 heartbeats, Clara. You're pregnant with twins." The silence that followed was absolute. The world stopped spinning. It stopped breathing. Clara stared at those 2 flickers, the 2 pulses that changed the trajectory of the universe. "Twins," Clara whispered. The word felt like a prayer and a sentence at once. "Based on the size, I'd say you're about 10 weeks along," Dr. Amara said. "You were pregnant when the stress began." Clara closed her eyes. Silas. This was the future they had talked about in the quiet of their mansion. These were the children he had decided he didn't have room for in his optimized life. And they were here. They had survived the divorce, the move, the grief, and the fall on the pavement. "Does the father know?" Dr. Amara asked carefully. Clara looked at the screen again. She thought of Silas laughing on the street with Julian. She thought of the anchor he wanted to rip away so he could be free. If she told him now, he would come back, not out of love, but out of duty. He would turn their lives into a legal negotiation. He would look at these two tiny heartbeats and see another calculated risk. She thought of the stories she would tell them. She would tell them about a king who lived in a glass fortress, a man who was so busy looking at the stars that he never noticed the gold at his feet. She would call him the Shadow King. No, Clara said, her voice growing stronger, a new protective steel settling into her bones. She pressed her hand to her stomach, shielding the two lives within. There is no father. It's just them, and it's just me. She checked herself out of the hospital that evening. She walked back to her rattling apartment, her head held high. She sat on the floor and looked at the dying plant. It had sprouted a tiny green shoot in the center. "We're going to be okay," she whispered into the silence. She had been discarded as a burden. She had been left with the scraps. But as she lay in the dark that night, listening to the two tiny pulses that Silas Thorne would never know about, Clara Vance realized she wasn't alone. She was a sanctuary, and the Shadow King was the one who was truly empty.
Time did not heal Clara's wounds. It simply layered them beneath the heavy, exhausting reality of survival. 9 months passed in a blur of iron-tasting supplements, swollen ankles, and the relentless, rhythmic dance of two lives growing within her. She had become a ghost in her own city, a woman who answered phones for a living, and spent her nights whispering fairy tales to a stomach that grew larger and more demanding by the day. She had named them in her heart, Finn and Arthur. She told them about the world they were entering, a world where they wouldn't have a glass fortress, but they would have a mother who would never, ever walk away. But the body keeps a different kind of ledger than the heart, and Clara's debt was coming due. The anemia Dr. Amara had warned her about had turned into a predatory force. By her 34th week, her hands shook so violently she could barely hold a pen. Her blood pressure spiked and dipped like a failing stock market. She was working from home now, her tiny apartment cluttered with medical files and routing slips, the air thick with the smell of the cheap protein shakes she forced down to keep her strength up. It was a Tuesday evening when the world finally shattered. The city was gripped by a late-term storm. Rain hammered against the rattling windows, and the wind howled through the cracks in the masonry. Clara was sitting on her small rug, trying to perform the once simple task of tying her slip-on shoes. She needed to walk to the corner store for milk, but her fingers wouldn't cooperate. They were cold, numb, and trembling. She tried once. The lace slipped. She tried again, her breath hitching. On the third attempt, she burst into tears. It was the indignity of it. The millionaire's ex-wife, once draped in silk and diamonds, now defeated by a shoelace in a room that smelled of damp carpet. "Pull yourself together," she whispered, wiping her face with a shaking hand. "They need you." But she didn't have anything left to give. A sharp, jagged pain suddenly tore through her lower back, wrapping around her abdomen like a hot wire. It wasn't the dull ache of Braxton Hicks she had grown used to. This was a violent, rhythmic tightening that stole the oxygen from her lungs. She gasped, her hand flying to her stomach. "Not yet," she pleaded. "You're too early. Please, not yet." The babies didn't listen. Another contraction hit, harder than the first. Clara tried to reach for her phone on the coffee table, but her legs were leaden, her vision blurring at the edges. She leaned forward, her fingers brushing the plastic casing of the phone, but another wave of agony made her flinch. The phone skittered across the table and slid onto the floor, vanishing into the dark gap beneath the old sofa. "No!" she cried out. She dropped to her knees, crawling toward the sofa, her forehead pressed against the floor as she reached into the dust and darkness. Her fingers brushed the phone, but she couldn't grip it. The room began to spin. The ceiling fan above her rotated slowly, a hypnotic, mocking circle. She felt something wet and warm between her legs. Blood or water, she didn't know.
The copper taste of blood filled her mouth. She had bitten her tongue in the struggle. The darkness was closing in, soft and heavy, like a velvet shroud. "Help!" she whispered, but the storm drowned her out. Her last thought before the lights went out was of Silas. Not the man who had divorced her, but the man he used to be. He'll never know, she thought. The Shadow King will never know what he left behind. Across the city, Silas Thorne was sitting in a restaurant that smelled of truffle oil and success. He was celebrating the close of the Sterling deal with Julian Vex. A bottle of vintage champagne sat in a silver bucket between them. "To focus," Julian said, raising his glass, "to empires and the men brave enough to rule them alone." Silas raised his glass, but the wine tasted like ash. He hadn't slept well in months. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw a trembling hand signing a divorce paper. Every time he looked at his optimized life, he saw only a vast, glittering void. His phone buzzed on the table. He ignored it. "Spam," Julian dismissed, gesturing to the waiter. It buzzed again, then a third time. "Popular tonight," Julian joked, but Silas felt a cold prickle of dread at the back of his neck. He picked up the phone. It was an unknown number, but it had called 4 times in 3 minutes. "Hello?" Silas asked, standing abruptly. He walked toward the quieter foyer of the restaurant. "Hello? Is this Silas Thorne?" The voice on the other end was professional, urgent, and underlined with the chaotic noise of a hospital emergency room. "Yes," Silas said. "Who is this?" "This is Pilar, a nurse at City General. We have an emergency involving Clara Vance. Sir, your name is still listed as her primary contact. She's been brought in with a catastrophic placental abruption. She's undergoing an emergency C-section for twins." The champagne glass slipped from Silas's hand. It shattered on the marble floor, a crystalline explosion that drew the eyes of every diner in the room. Silas didn't see them. He didn't see the world at all. "Twins?" he whispered. "Clara? She's pregnant?" "Sir, there isn't time for that." The nurse voice was like a whip. "She's hemorrhaging. Her blood pressure is 60/40. She has AB negative blood, the rarest type. We're out of stock. The regional banks are empty. We've searched every database. You are the only person listed in her history who is a match. Only your blood can save her and your sons." Silas felt the glass fortress of his life shatter into a million jagged pieces. The anchor he had ripped away wasn't a burden, it was his heart, and it was bleeding out on a table miles away. "I'm coming," Silas said, his voice a growl of desperation. "Tell the doctors, tell them to do everything. I'm coming." He didn't wait for his coat. He didn't speak to Julian. He ran out of the restaurant into the driving rain, his expensive leather shoes splashing through the puddles he had once been too proud to step in. He got behind the wheel of his car, the engine roaring like a wounded beast. He drove like a madman. He ran red lights, swerved around taxis, and ignored the sirens of the city. His mind was a storm of guilt. He had left her. He had told her she was holding him back, and all that time she had been carrying his children. She had faced every appointment alone. She had felt the move alone. She had faced the fear of death alone, all because he wanted to optimize his future. "What have I done?" he screamed internally. He reached the hospital, parking his car crookedly across the emergency bay. He burst through the automatic doors, soaked to the bone, his chest heaving. "Clara Vance," he roared at the desk. "I'm Silas Thorne. I'm the donor." A nurse appeared, her face grim. "Follow me. We need to move now." They led him through a maze of white corridors that smelled of antiseptic and death. He saw the doors to the delivery suite burst open. A team of doctors rushed past, wheeling 2 tiny transparent incubators. Inside were 2 tiny infants, so small they looked like dolls, hooked to a forest of wires and tubes. "My sons," he whispered, reaching out a hand, but the team didn't stop. They were fighting for every second. The nurse pushed him into a small, sterile room. "Sit, roll up your sleeve." Silas sat. He watched the needle enter his vein. He watched the dark crimson life force leave his body and fill the collection bag. He had spent his life taking land, taking companies, taking freedom. For the first time, he was giving. "Is she alive?" he asked, his voice breaking. "She's fighting, Mr. Thorne," the nurse said, taping the line. "But she's tired. She's been fighting alone for a long time." Silas closed his eyes as his blood flowed into the bag that would be carried into the next room to keep Clara's heart beating. He prayed to a God he hadn't spoken to in years. "Take it all," he begged. "Take the money, the buildings, the focus. Just don't let her die. Don't let the Shadow King be the last thing she remembers."
The room was too quiet, save for the rhythmic, mechanical hiss of the blood collection machine. Silas sat in the stiff vinyl chair, his arm outstretched, watching the dark crimson liquid travel through the plastic tubing. It was a strange, humbling sight. His own life force, the same blood that had fueled his cold ambitions and his relentless climb to the top, was now the only currency that mattered. "How is she?" Silas asked, his voice sounding thin and hollow in the sterile room. Pilar, the nurse who had stayed with him, adjusted the flow. "The surgeons are working to stabilize her. Your blood is being processed and sent in real time. It's a direct lifeline, Mr. Thorne. You are literally keeping her heart beating right now." Silas closed his eyes. A bitter laugh caught in his throat. He had spent years trying to separate his life from Clara's, trying to sever every tie until he was free. And yet, here they were, more physically connected than they had ever been. His blood was flowing into her veins, his pulse becoming her pulse. The divorce papers in his briefcase meant nothing. Biology was rewriting the contract. "The boys," he whispered, the word still feeling like a brand on his tongue. "Can I see them?" "They've been moved to the NICU. They're stable for now, but they were born at 34 weeks. They're small, Silas, very small." Once the collection bag was full, the nurse moved with a speed that signaled the end of the grace period. She pressed a piece of gauze to Silas's arm and taped it down. "Stay seated for 10 minutes. You'll be dizzy." Silas didn't stay for 10 seconds. As soon as she turned her back, he stood up. The room spun, the floor tilting like the deck of a ship in a storm, but he gritted his teeth and forced his legs to move. He followed the signs for the neonatal intensive care unit, his heart hammering a frantic, erratic rhythm against his ribs. He found the glass walls of the NICU. Inside, the world was a forest of monitors and glowing screens. He saw a doctor he recognized, Dr. Amara, the man who had seen Clara 9 months ago. He was leaning over a twin incubator, his face etched with focus. Silas pressed his hand against the glass. "Dr. Amara." The doctor looked up, his eyes widening in recognition. He stepped out into the hallway, pulling off his surgical mask. "Mr. Thorne, I didn't expect to see you here." "I gave the blood," Silas said, his voice shaking. "How are they?" Dr. Amara sighed, a sound of heavy, cautious optimism. "They are fighters, Silas, just like their mother. We've named them Baby A and Baby B on the charts, but Clara had been whispering names to them for months." "Finn and Arthur," Silas said, remembering the names Clara had once loved. "Yes," Amara nodded. "They're in respiratory distress, which is common for preemies, but they're responding to the surfactants. Would you like to touch them?" Silas hesitated. He looked at his hands, the hands that had signed away his family, the hands that had built skyscrapers but had never held a child. He felt unworthy of the air in the room, but the longing was a physical ache. He followed the doctor through the scrub-in station and into the warm, humming quiet of the unit. He stopped before the double incubator. Inside were 2 infants, so tiny they looked like they were made of porcelain and hope. They were hooked to a dozen wires, their chests heaving with the effort of every breath. Silas reached through the circular port of the incubator. He touched the tiny hand of the baby on the left, Finn.
The infant's fingers were no thicker than matchsticks, but as soon as Silas's skin brushed his, the baby's hand uncurled and wrapped around his pinky finger. The grip was surprisingly strong. It was a desperate, grounding hold that shattered what was left of Silas Thorne's composure. Tears he hadn't shed since childhood spilled over, hot and silent, tracking through the salt and rain on his face. "I'm so sorry," he whispered, his forehead leaning against the plastic of the incubator. "I'm so sorry I wasn't there. I'm so sorry you had to fight for your first breath without me." He stayed there for an eternity, held captive by a child who didn't even know his name. He looked at Arthur, the second twin, who was sleeping fitfully, his tiny features a perfect, haunting miniature of Clara's. "Mr. Thorne?" Pilar appeared at the door. "Clara is out of surgery. She's in the recovery suite. She's awake, but she's very weak." Silas extracted his finger with a gentleness he didn't know he possessed. He looked at his sons one last time, a silent promise forming in the marrow of his bones. "I will spend the rest of my life trying to deserve this." He walked to the recovery wing. The room was dim, the only light coming from the moon breaking through the clouds outside. Clara lay in the bed, looking like a ghost. Her skin was translucent, her breathing aided by an oxygen mask, but her eyes were open. She turned her head slowly as he entered. When she saw him, her pupils dilated with a mixture of shock and a deep, ancient pain. Silas stopped at the edge of the bed. He didn't know what to say. There were no words in the language of men that could fix 18 years of missed moments and the 9 months of absolute abandonment. "You," she rasped, the word barely a breath behind the mask. "I'm here, Clara," Silas said, his voice thick with a sob he was trying to swallow. "I'm here. I'm not leaving." She looked at the IV line in her arm, the red fluid slowly trickling into her body. She looked back at him, her eyes tracing the bandage on his own arm. She knew. She realized that the blood keeping her heart beating was the same blood she once loved and then learned to fear. "Why?" she whispered. "Because I was a fool," Silas said, dropping to his knees beside her bed. He took her hand, the same hand he had watched tremble in the courtroom. "Because the Shadow King was a ghost, Clara. I thought I wanted focus, but I was just blind. I didn't know about the boys. I didn't know about anything. I did it alone," she said, a single tear tracking into her hair. "I know," Silas choked out, "and I will spend every second of my life making sure you never have to be alone again. If you'll let me. If you'll let me be a shadow in your hallway, a servant at your door. I don't care. I just want to be where you are." Clara looked at him, and for a moment, Silas saw the woman who had wished him well in the rain. She didn't forgive him. Forgiveness was a mountain they hadn't even begun to climb, but she didn't pull her hand away. She let him hold it as the sun began to rise over the city, a pale gold light that touched the broken pieces of their lives. Silas Thorne, the man who had everything, sat on the floor of a hospital room, realizing that for the first time in his life, he finally had something worth keeping. He had a debt of blood, and he would pay it with every breath he had left.
The morning light was no longer the bruised purple of the storm or the pale, uncertain gold of the dawn. It was a bright, clear white, illuminating every corner of the recovery room with a clinical, unforgiving honesty. Silas Thorne had not moved from his spot on the floor beside Clara's bed. His expensive suit was wrinkled, his hair was a mess, and the bandage on his arm was a small white badge of his transition from a titan of industry to a man who finally understood the cost of a soul. Clara moved slightly, a small hiss of pain escaping her as she adjusted her weight. The oxygen mask had been replaced by a nasal cannula, and some of the color, his color, Silas realized, had returned to her cheeks. She looked at him,
her gaze lingering on the dark circles under his eyes. "You should go home, Silas," she said. Her voice was stronger, though still thin, like a thread that had been stretched but refused to snap. "You have meetings. You have the penthouse. You have the focus you fought so hard for." Silas looked up at her, and the smile that touched his lips was sad and weary. "The penthouse is just a high-altitude box, Clara. And the meetings, I've spent 18 years talking to men about things that don't breathe. I'm done with that." He stood up slowly, his joints popping. He reached for a small plastic cup of water on the nightstand and held it out to her. This time, her hand didn't tremble as much when she took it. "I spoke to the doctors while you were sleeping," Silas said. "Finn and Arthur, they're off the ventilators. They're breathing on their own. Arthur has your nose, by the way, and Finn has a grip like he's already planning to take over the world." A soft, genuine light flickered in Clara's eyes, the first spark of joy Silas had seen in nearly a year. "Can I see them?" "Dr. Amara is bringing them in. He said you needed the contact. He said we needed the contact." As if on cue, the heavy door swung open. Dr. Amara entered, pushing a double bassinet, followed by Pilar. The two infants were swaddled tight in striped hospital blankets, their tiny faces pink and wrinkled, looking out at a world that had nearly lost them before it even knew their names. Silas watched as Pilar carefully lifted Finn and placed him in Clara's arms. Then the nurse turned to Silas. "Mr. Thorne, your turn." Silas felt a surge of panic, a fear more primal than any market crash or hostile takeover. I don't want to break him." "You won't," Pilar said, her voice a gentle command. "He's made of your blood now, Silas. He knows you." She placed Arthur in Silas's arms. The baby was light, impossibly light, but as Silas cradled him against his chest, he felt a weight settle into his heart that he knew would never leave. He felt the tiny, rhythmic thump of a heartbeat against his sternum. It was a mirror of his own. For a long time, there was no sound in the room except for the soft, wet sighs of the babies. Silas and Clara sat in the silence, a mother and a father tethered together by two tiny lives and a shared pulse. "What happens now, Silas?" Clara asked, her eyes never leaving Finn's face. "You can't just buy a new life. You can't write a check for the 9 months I spent wondering if I would survive the night. You can't undo the courtroom." "I know," Silas said, his voice a low rumble of absolute honesty. "I'm not asking for a reset. I'm asking for a beginning. I've already stepped down from the Sterling project. I've told Julian if he wants the Empire, he can have it. I'm selling the penthouse." Clara looked up, stunned. "You're giving it all up?" "I'm not giving anything up," Silas corrected, looking at Arthur, then at her. "I'm finally keeping what matters. I've bought a house, a real house, Clara. It has a garden with dirt and trees that actually grow. It's near the park where I saw you that day, the one where I looked so happy while you were hiding behind a tree." Clara flinched. "You saw me?" "I didn't recognize you in the moment. I was too busy being the Shadow King. But I see you now. I see all of you. I want to be the man who ties the shoes, Clara. I want to be the man who hears the crying at 3 a.m. I don't want to be optimized. I want to be useful." Clara was silent for a long time. She looked at the red fluid still in the bag, nearly empty now, that had saved her life. She looked at the man who had been a monster and now was just a human being, failing, trying, and broken. "I don't know if I can love you again, Silas. The ink is dry on those papers." "Then let me be your friend," Silas said. "Let me be the father to these boys. Let me prove to you every single day that the blood we share is stronger than the promises I broke. I'll stay in the guest room. I'll stay in the garden. I'll stay wherever you put me, as long as I'm in the same world as you." Clara looked at her sons, then at the man who had provided the Crimson Bridge for them to cross back into life. She saw the bandage on his arm. She felt the warmth of his blood still circulating through her heart. "Finn needs a new blanket," she said quietly. "The blue one in the bag under the chair." It wasn't a yes, it wasn't a declaration of love, but it was a task, it was a place, it was a beginning. Silas stood up, a fierce, protective light in his eyes. He reached for the bag, moving with a purpose he'd never felt in a boardroom. He was no longer the Shadow King. He was a father. He was a man with a debt he would happily spend the rest of his life paying. Outside the hospital, the city hummed on, oblivious to the fact that 4 lives had been resurrected. Skyscrapers rose towards the clouds, symbols of ambition and height. But in room 847, the world was small, warm, and grounded. The Shadow King had finally stepped out of the glass fortress and into the light. And for the first time in his life, Silas Thorne was truly, undeniably free. This story reminds us that no matter how far we wander or how many mistakes we make, it is never too late to come home to what truly matters. Love is the only empire worth building, and sacrifice is the only currency that lasts. If this story touched your soul, please share it with someone who needs to hear that second chances are real. Thank you for being part of our beautiful family. We would love to hear from you. What was your favorite part of Silas and Clara's journey? And we are so curious to know where in the world you are joining us from today. Please leave a comment below and let us know which city or country you are watching from today. We read every single one. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that touch the heart. Until next time, keep choosing love.